Episode 172, Why Regeneration? This is the World Organic News for the week ending 10th of June 2019. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Today we're going to discuss regeneration, in particular regeneration of the soil and ecosystems. Over the last 50 to 75 years, well basically since the Second World War, we've gone through a period of destruction. In effect, a Faustian bargain in which we gave up 1% of our topsoil every year in return for production returns. We did this by using chemicals, chemical fertilisers, chemical pesticides, herbicides and fungicides, and to some extent it worked. There were lots of famines and people starving in the 1970s. A lot of the techniques developed with chemical inputs saved many people, kept them alive. But the cost. That bill is coming due and we need to pay for it now. If we wait, the cost will be so much higher. A few years back, maybe 20, the idea of sustainability started to kick off. And that was about halting the decline, holding things steady. And even then, that wasn't enough. It was never going to be. You could see it then. Being sustainable was great, but it wasn't going to actually improve things. And as we're growing more people each year, we need to actually do something so that we can feed them. We need to do this by improving our soils. Regeneration is about returning that which has been ripped out of the soil by the use of agricultural chemicals. We've been living through a J curve. We're in the first part of the J at the bottom of the curve. We're in a position where we can start growing the longer part of that curve, the bit that goes up. Out of everything we've lost, it's what's gone missing from the soil, that is, carbon, and carbon is just a proxy for life on this planet. Much soil nowadays is just a matrix used to contain the chemicals used to grow the food. It is in effect a huge hydroponic system. If you've seen the film King Corn, link in the show notes, you know this is the case because they pump ammonia into the soil, liquid ammonia, which is just nitrogen in liquid form, and it does give the corn a kick. I'm not sure it does any good in the long run, but it grows an awful lot of corn leaf. And not just sweet corn or flour corn, but a type of corn that can be treated like crude oil. It's chemically fractionated and torn apart, and then fed to stock and people and whatnot. We get wonderful things from this like high fructose corn syrup, and diabetes as a result, type 2. We got to this point because there was a growing population on this planet, and there was a hell of a lot of nitrogen left over after the Second World War, because nitrogen is a key part of nitroglycerine and other explosives. Once the war ended somewhat quicker than people expected, there was an awful lot of this stuff left over, and the industrial capacity to continue making more. A way was found to use it in conjunction with increased mechanisation on farms. Increased use of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium as well, obviously, because you need the three major elements, and the growth of monocultural production just exploded. There was a time in the 1960s and 70s when the American farm system went from paying people not to grow crops to paying people to grow extra crops. This was in response to both an ideological change and also the fact that there were so many people suffering famines. I still remember photo images on the ABC News of thousands upon thousands of people in India living in stormwater drains, piled on top of each other to give them some sort of housing, and so that they could be fed nearby. It was not a good time. The Green Revolution built upon this and selected seeds for hybridisation. All these things interacted to basically kill off the soil. An article a little while ago stated the UK has probably got 30 to 40 harvests left in their soil before it is completely gone. And the UK has always had a reasonable reputation for good soils. When you start applying these sorts of industrialised processes to the ancient soils of Australia, you end up with problems, big problems. We are fortunately on deep red volcanic soil here, but even that's not without limit. It's soil that feeds us, all of us on this planet, that and the fact that it rains from time to time. There seems to be a series of things going on as the soil dries out, so that the climate dries too. I know there's climate change as well, and that's exacerbating things, but ever since colonisation here and the clearing of forestry, there's been a drying out of the continent. The lack of fire stick farming by Europeans has altered the nature of our soils, as did the original use of fire stick farming to start with. There are always consequences for actions. Mechanised farming in the developed world, and increasingly across the developing world, was the only game in town after the Second World War. So all the best and brightest minds that went into developing ways to make the industrial system as efficient as possible. And I guess that was fair enough at the time. There were people starving, there was money to be made, there was careers to be created. The end point of that, of course, is not so much an excess of food, because there are still people starving, but a waste of food, and on the technological level you end up with something like Monsanto, developing seeds that only grow in paddocks sprayed with glyphosate and planted with hybridised seeds that you need to repurchase each year from Monsanto. The seeds have been genetically modified to be able to resist the effects of the glyphosate. A quick word on genetically modified crops. Genetic modification is something humans have done to plant seeds since we came into contact with them. We were just another evolutionary pressure on the seeds. Now, if you're going to bring a new seed batch to market, one that's rust resistant or better able to cope with drought or whatever, I see no problem with using GM techniques. When companies start putting fish genes in tomatoes so that they can grow in the frosts, then I have an issue. And then there's what else Monsanto did. The technology which could have been used for improving seeds was used to alter them so that the seed could only work when they were bathed in glyphosate, and they had the ability to withstand that genetically engineered into them. The glyphosate then wiped out all the competing weeds, and this is great if that's what you're trying to do. If you don't want anything else growing, and this improvement, in inverted commas, is where the trouble with Monsanto's genetic modification begins. There are so many things wrong with this that it's just not funny. What it means to start with, every time you spray a weed crop, you're selecting for weeds that have the ability to withstand the glyphosate. Not surprisingly, 5 or 10 years after this system was developed, Roundup-resistant weeds emerged, which meant that you either had to cultivate more, that is, use more fossil fuels, or find an even more potent chemical, not that glyphosate is that special anyway. The misuse of genetic modification by Monsanto has done much to destroy the idea that there is some good in genetic modification. In the long term, a lot of the chemicals have really nasty side effects and linger in the environment, despite what they say on the tin. I'll have another episode on the effects of Roundup coming, and why we really should be getting rid of it. This development is the sort of logical endpoint of industrial agricultural systems. If it's not Monsanto and glyphosate, it'll be another seed company and another poison. Best to stop. Back to the need for regenerative agriculture. As I said, all the best and brightest minds went into the industrial agricultural systems. For the people going into agriculture, it was science about the ideas, and it seemed to be working. People were growing more people were being fed, famines declined. Now, the trouble with a lot of the science that was taught during this period, and actual soil science for that matter, only ever covered the physics and chemistry of soil, things like pH, how the particles interact with each other and how they behaved under different water regimes and so on. But there was rarely any mention of biology in the soil, because after all, you didn't have to worry about that sort of nonsense that the chemicals were feeding the world. As a reaction to this paradigm, there arose across the world a back to the land movement in the 60s. Hippies, communes, that sort of thing. But there were also others like John Seymour and his wonderful book, The Complete Book of Self-Sufficiency, which is where I started my organic journey. Seymour et al. Were going back to organics by using systems from prior to the introduction of chemical fertilizers. Basically, just using industrial systems without the chemical fertilizers. Now, Seymour himself used horses rather than tractors and spread manure, or used animals to leave their manure where he wanted it. So it wasn't exactly the same, but basically a lot of the organic farms we see now are just chemical farms with the chemicals removed. Yields dropped some to begin with, but so too did costs. When you're not having to buy all the fertilisers, chemicals and whatnot, and you're growing these amendments to the soil through your own farm systems, you save money. So some farms became more profitable, but less food was grown to start with. There was also a fellow by the name of John Jeevons who came up with a similar sort of system, but at a garden level. He didn't involve animals, and his system does involve a lot of double digging each year in the garden beds. Then 85% of the stuff that was growing went through the compost to feed the soil for the 10% you ate and the 5% you sold for profit. A lot of these older systems described as new ways of doing things were not. Yet they were the beginnings of the sustainability movements. The idea you needed to stop what we were doing with chemicals, and we need to save the soils that we've got. We need to keep them alive. At the same time, people like Masanobu Fukuoka of the One Straw Revolution, who didn't use chemicals, but did use animals, ducks, was able to grow soil. I'll be doing a whole episode on Fukuoka's methods because I think it's time for a refresh of those in the near future. And I'll also probably be doing a video to show you his grain growing system as I set it up over the next few months on my place. And of course in the 70s and 80s we had the sainted Bill Mollison and the development of permaculture. So what commenced as a return to old ways then developed new ways of doing things. It wasn't just in the English and Japanese speaking worlds. People developed systems in India and Bangladesh. There's a system called zero budget natural farming that was developed in India and does what it says on the tin, using available resources to create biology in the soil. And it works wonderfully. An older system developed in the late 19th century, biodynamics, by one Rudolf Steiner, involves creating and maintaining soil biology too. Biodynamics has been taken up by large numbers of grape wine growers as a way to improve their soil, their harvests and the ecosystems that they're growing in. It's a system that works. And a word of explanation, like permaculture, biodynamics has probably got two wings to it. I'll be blunt here, but I'm not being judgmental. You just need to be aware that there are two sides to these things. I've heard these two streams described as being the purple and the brown. The brown wing of biodynamics and permaculture, for that matter, focuses on food production, soil health and getting things done at a commercial level. The purple side focuses somewhat on these things too, but could also be described as a bit woo-woo or perhaps better described as esoteric, which is fine if you want to do that. I'm not denigrating it. But for those of you reading and coming in contact with the biodynamics and or permaculture systems for the first time, just be aware that what you're reading may not resonate with you because of the purple-brown dichotomy. I'm definitely in the brown school. So we have these regenerative techniques, Fukuoka, zero-budget natural farming, permaculture, biodynamics and their ilk. The facts are they work, and the point of them is to get more soil carbon or more soil biology, which is the same thing, happening. This includes fungal bacteria, fungal activity, the bacteria, and even soil viruses. There are positive ones as well as negative, as there are with bacteria and fungus. The point is we can replace all the artificial fertilizers, artificial herbicides, pesticides, fungicides with natural systems, complex ecosystems. There is going to be a period of adjustment, but we can start now, especially as lands come out of drought or after fire events or even flooding. Cleanish slate, start as you mean to go on. The other thing that happened with industrial agriculture that no one talked about at the time, and I've mentioned before, was the loss of soil carbon. Soil carbon is destroyed every time you plough the soil, turn it over, or expose it to the air in some way. It's this aspect that has climate change implications. As you can imagine, this is quite a bit of an issue given everything else going on in the industrialised world. The good news is regenerative farming, that is, the complete antithesis of chemical farming, sucks the carbon back out of the atmosphere and puts it in the soil. I've heard calculations on this that are quite mind-boggling. Originally I heard that a 3% increase in soil carbon across the soils of Australia would remove all the carbon we'd put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, which seemed a bit excessive to me, but they'd done their maths. The latest thinking is that if 2/3 of the world's agricultural land was increasing its soil carbon by 2%, then we will remove all the excess carbon in the atmosphere since 1750 or thereabouts. And we can do this in 2 to 5 years, depending on weather conditions and that sort of thing. We can actually make a difference within the 12 years, 11 and a half, since the IPCC people came out and said we had 12 years to go last October. So we're in a position where we can actually reverse all of climate change, all of the carbon dioxide related to climate change anyway. The methane being released by the tundra is problematic, but we can do this carbon thing in the soil. We need to do it probably quicker than slower. And there'll be more on that in coming episodes. Just a quick word on the benefits of regenerative agriculture and regenerative garden, and even a regenerative approach to life itself, actually. In regard to the soil, regenerative agriculture and gardening has many benefits other than the climate ones. By removing all the chemical inputs, we give the soil a chance to heal. We produce food that returns to the nutrient levels of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Protein levels were much higher in wheat then than they are now. I'm going to do another episode on that later too. Once the soil's been cleaned, then water becomes clean because the water going into the waterways has been filtered through healthy soils. It's not got all the rubbish going into it. Natural systems have a chance to repair themselves. The beneficial organisms aren't being killed off constantly by the chemical inputs. And when the water's clean and the soil's clean, then the air becomes cleaner too. And on that note, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Podcasting checklists are still available over at John Moore Podcasting Services. Link in the show notes if you want to start your own podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.